practices. In order for the wedding to take place, the bride and groom or their fathers needed to consent to the wedding. Generally, the wedding would take place in June due to the god Juno. And this is a ancient Roman wedding we're talking about. Weddings would never take place on days that were considered unlucky. During the wedding, the groom would pretend to kidnap the bride. This was done to convince the household guardians or layers that the bride did not go willingly. Afterwards, the bride and the groom had their first sexual experience on a couch called a lectus. In a Roman wedding, both sexes had to wear specific clothing. Boys had to wear the toga virilis, while the bride to wear a wreath, a veil, a yellow hairnet, chaplets of roses, sex creams, and hasta calaveras. All of the guests would wear the same clothes as the groom. Kind of sounds like an American wedding, don't it? In the same clothes as the bride. The Romans believed that if a bad omen showed up during a wedding, it would indicate the couple was evil or unlucky. In order for a marriage to be successful, there needed to be no evil omens, and everyone must follow the traditional customs. Now, there are many different traditions and things that went on with the Romans and the Greek weddings, but in continuing in the Roman engagement was known as sponsalia. In the sponsalia, the maiden was promised to the groom by her father or her tutor. The promise could be made directly to the groom, but was usually made by the groom's father. As part of the engagement, the groom would place an engagement ring known as a annulus pronibus on the bride's ring finger. This finger was chosen as it was believed that a vein known as a vena amoris connected it directly to the heart. Then the bride's family would pay the groom. To promise his daughter to the groom, the bride's father told the groom's father, Spondesceni galam, tuum filame, or galam filiflame. However, the bride's father could cancel the wedding at any time. For a wedding to take place, the bride and groom, or the father in each family, needed to consent. Augustus decreed that if the bride's father did not agree to the marriage, he must provide a reason. Marriage between children was also outlawed. The youngest marriageable ages were 14 for a man and 12 for a woman. This is in the ancient Roman weddings. The Romans never practiced polygamy, so both parties had to be unmarried, and the bride and groom could not be related. The groom chose the wedding date. However, he could not choose any day of the year, as many were considered unlucky. June was the preferred month, as it was the month of Juno, the god of childbirth and marriage. Before the wedding, the bride's family sought the protection of the god by performing small sacrifices and giving coins to Laius. The wedding took place at the house of the bride's father. There was a large feast at which the attendees were served a special cake made with grape juice. Augustus limited the cost of 3 feasts to 1,000 sesterces. By evening, the groom pretended to take the bride by force from her mother's arms, so the household gods would not think the bride was willingly leaving them. The Romans believed the only bride of value was a virgin who had to be stolen from her family. Because of this, the Romans simulated the bride being abducted from her family. The tradition dictated that the bride cry out in pain as she was herded along the route to her new house. As the bride was taken to her new home, guests sang the Hymenaeus and carried a white horn torch, a spina alba, to honor Ceres. When the procession reached the groom's house, the groom entered first. The bride then entered after smearing the doorway with sheep's wool covered in oil and fat. As bride would have no god protecting her until she arrived at the groom's house. When the bride arrived at the house of the groom, she may have spoken the words, Ubitu Gaius ego Gaia. The bride was officially taken into her husband's family by fire and water, an act symbolic of life. To visualize the consummation of marriage, the groom broke a loaf of bread over the bride's head. Sheaves of wheat could also be thrown at the bride. And once at the groom's house, the married couple relaxed on a rich ornamented couch or bed called a lectus and had their first sexual experience together. As soon as the couple entered either the bedroom or the groom's house, they were considered married. So those are just some of the uh, traditions of the Romans and the Greeks, and they also had a tradition that that the bride would be taken to the groom's house without the groom there prior to the day of marriage, and she would have her first sexual act with a young male child in order to make, and he had to have both a mother and a father. So therefore, they would make sure that she was sexually fertile. So they had some strange beliefs, and that goes today to the same as the British and the English weddings, that they would today during English and British weddings they have something known as throwing rice up in the air or throwing rice on the groom, symbolizing wealth and fertility and love, and tying bands around each other's hands and hanging. It all goes back to ancient pagan rituals. And today, when someone gets married, traditionally, they go on something called a honeymoon, which goes back thousands of years. And the meaning of the honeymoon tradition is the honeymoon tradition first originated, well, they say first originated, but just do research and everything goes back. But it really took off originating in the 5th century during the medieval times. Although the customs we know it today symbolize romance and celebration, it derives from marriage by capture, as we were reading with the Roman and the Greek weddings. An ancient practice in which the groom would kidnap his bride with the intention of impregnating her without her family objecting. The groom would hold the bride captive until the family would either give up or the search for the bride would the family would give up because the bride would become pregnant, making all questions of her return moot. So with either outcome, the couple wouldn't be able to nullify their marriage. So in reality, what they do is they would kidnap the bride, and then they would have something they called the honeymoon, which was the full moon, and they would become drunken for 30 days of just drunken, weird stuff going on with this something called honey ale. So the traditions of weddings are really stem back from thousands of years, and the same goes for groomsmen and bridegrooms. And in reality, when we have a traditional wedding today, you have the bridegrooms, they have the grooms have what, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 groomsmen, and the bridesmaid has the same amount, and number of bride has that many of bridesmaid. But they didn't always exist like we have them today. It comes from a more unromantic reason. That's why we have bridesmaids and bridegrooms. Everybody wants their close friends around them, their family, their loved ones when they get married. In reality, they have no clue what they're really taking on the traditions of ancient pagan cultures. But these titles don't always have such a deep emotional connection associated with them. It was simply the law according to the Roman ritual. Confarietto, 10 witnesses were required to be present at a wedding while the couples recited sacred verses. Though these witnesses were all men, female attendants did escort the bride to the groom's house, home for the ceremony. This is why we get down on one knee to propose. I never understood that. That always bothered me for some reason, but the whole reason they do that is because it all comes back all from Roman paganism. And the first bridesmaids appeared before ancient Rome in the Bible story. Jacob. In reality, they weren't really bridesmaids, and they only had, usually take the case of Rebecca or Leah. Everybody had a handmaid back then. Sometimes one, two if you were wealthy. That would help the bride. But some people might even go back and consider them bridesmaids, but it's a handmaiden. Groomsmen, however, have a much darker backstory. Much of their history revolves around marriages by capture, like we were reading, where a bride was literally captured and abducted from her family. This practice started way back in those days. In some traditions, groomsmen were called bride's knights because they helped carry the bride to the wedding. Best case scenario, they were taking her from her disapproving relatives to be joined with the man she loved, protecting her from kidnappers. It's believed that the best man role originated with 16th century Germanic Goths. As the groomsman who kidnapped the bride, the best man then stood next to the bride during the ceremony to prevent other suitors or family members from taking her and to make sure she didn't run away. Thankfully, the roles bridesmaid and groomsmen have today are much different. But as we know, the devil being so cunning as he is, that he makes everything look so innocent now, doesn't he? Halloween, Christmas, abortion. He just does it in a more subtle way now than he did 4,000 years ago. Namely, coordinating bachelor and bachelorette parties help organize the wedding and make sure the bride and groom have the best day possible. And if they happen to catch a bouquet or garter in the process, all the better. We know where that comes from. So, brethren, those are just a few examples of ancient practices done thousands of years ago into today's traditions that we do today in weddings today. But I want to focus on the real wedding, the wedding thousands of years. I want to focus on the Hebrew wedding. And I want you to listen carefully as we read exactly how the Hebrew wedding goes. And I want you to compare it to the weddings that we have just went over with, considering the Romans and the Greeks and the British and the English. And I want you to keep in mind the comparisons of how different these two weddings are. So I got to read one more article that I have. So just give me 1 second here, and I will go and give you the reading of the Hebrew wedding. So let me begin here. In ancient Hebrew wedding process, there was first there was a shidduchim, which is a matchmaking stage, and then there was a ketubah, which is a wedding contract. Then there was a nisaim, the marriage and the celebration, and then you had a yakka, the consummation stage. So shidduchim, this is a stage focused on the preliminary arrangements before a betrothal is legal. Marriages were legally binding oaths more in line with alliances and treaties between families than the modern times reflects. Both parties had to be interested in each other, but the modern concept of love wasn't as large of a component. So we're speaking of the Hebrew wedding. Then you have the Irusim, which is the betrothal stage. And the Irusim starts with the formation of the marriage contract, or the ketubah. And the ketubah is a legally binding document that outlines the groom's obligations to the bride to protect her, including financial responsibilities and rights in the case of divorce or the groom's death. The ketubah is signed by witnesses and given to the bride as part of the wedding ceremony. The ketubah had multiple stages. The conditions and requirements of the bride and groom to each other were their vows. The bride's itemized estate was listed in the ketubah: silver, property, livestock, investments, etc. That the bride would merge with the groom's estate upon marriage, or their inventory. The bride price, 50 shekels of silver, worth around a third of a year's 6 days a week labor income, or very roughly $30,000 in today's money. This was a down payment that could be fortified if the contract was voided, the bride divorced, or a second wife was taken without the consent of the bride and her father, and that was called mohar. The majority of the mohar would be given by the father to the daughter as a gift. A father that kept the majority or entirety of the mohar would have been considered unkind and brutal. The groom would also obtain an expensive gift to the bride called the matan. This could be jewelry, clothing, or other personalized items that symbolize the groom's commitment and affection for the bride, given at the signing of the ketubah as a promise that the groom would come back for his bride. And then you had the Irusim process. The Irusim betrothal process had a performative, multi-step purpose or process. The groom and his father would go to the bride's father's house and knock on the door. The bride had the opportunity not to open the door on the suiting groom. Once the door was opened by the future bride, the groom and father would be invited inside the home, given bread and wine, and a negotiation would happen. Once this was completed, the agreement would be taken to the public for review. The bride and groom would undergo a mikvah, ritual cleansing, bath, or baptism, then stand under a chuppah, and that is like a temporary, like a sukkot, like we have at the Feast of Tabernacles, temporary dwelling, where the groom would give the bride her matan gifts, with 2 or 3 witnesses observing, promising to return for her. The ketubah would be then signed for all to see, 3 copies would be made, one for the father of the bride, one for the married couple, and one sealed copy for the local judicial court where only a judge can rightfully break the seal in case of a disagreement and lawsuit. At this point, consummation and cohabitation did not yet happen. This begins the Irseen prep time where both parties are bound by contract. Then you have the Irseen prep time. At this time, the couple is legally bound to each other but does not yet live together as husband and wife. This part of the Irseen phase is marked by a time of preparation for both the groom and the bride, usually lasting 12 months. And then you had preparations by the groom. Most grooms did not have a home of their own but lived in a side addition in his father's house. So the newly betrothed groom would begin construction on full expansion onto his father's home for them to live in. As far as preparation for the bride, this is the time that the bride would learn all about the groom, all the lessons on how to be a wife. She would sew her valuable and spotless wedding dress. For this period, the bride and groom would not see each other. That said, messages were passed between the two by the friend of the groom. Then you had the Nisuin, or the wedding stage. The Nisuin, which means to take, is the stage of the wedding process in which the groom returns for his bride after about 12 months away. In this process, he symbolically and literally exultingly lifts her up from her father's household and brings her to the groom's father's house. He has built onto an extension on his father's house. The arrival is announced with great shofar, horn blasts, and often at midnight, as the groom's procession is lit by oil lamp walking down the street. Although the bride trusts that the groom would return for her after about a year, she did not know the day nor hour, and neither did her bridal party. It was only the father of the groom that gave the final approval for the son to go and collect his bride. Knowing that the son had fulfilled his obligations as a future husband, both physically, mentally, and emotionally, and he was ready to be a husband. Once the groom had reached the bride's home and lifted her onto a bridal litter, which was covered lounge lifted by 2 poles on either side. The bride and her party always made sure to keep oil lamps filled and ready at all times, not knowing when he would come and not wanting to keep him waiting. The groom even lifted his bride in a celebratory parade would then return to the home of the father for a private lock consummation and feast. Once back behind locked doors, the couple would finalize their vows and drink a cup of wine to signify their union. And then they had the yukka, which means the consummation stage, which means seclusion of togetherness, is the part of Nisuin where the bride, the kala and groom, Tan, are secluded together in a private space. The Cheda Chupa, immediately following the Nisuin ceremony. This symbolic act represents their first moment of privacy as a married couple and signifies their union, usually a 10 to 15 minute time frame where the bride and groom's parents, along with the 10 or so friends of the bride as well as the groom's 2 witnesses, would wait just outside for the evidence of virginity. The Simnanam shall Bactulum to be shown by the groom in a statement of, "It is done." This item was required as proof that the bride was a virgin. At the time of marriage, this was often demonstrated through the display of a blood-stained cloth or garment known as a cloth, a betulium, which would be shown to confirm that the bride had not had previous sexual relations. This was to protect the bride from accusations that she was not a virgin, if the groom wanted to sleep with her and then immediately divorce and get his wealth back. So, brethren, that's the Hebrew wedding. Now, tell me, of all the weddings we went over, the Roman, the Greek, the British, English, which one is fitting in God's sight? Is not the Hebrew wedding identical to the king returning home to his father's house to prepare many mansions, and then coming at a time that no one knows with a great sound of a trumpet blast at the midnight shout, ready to take his bride home back to his father's house? You see, brethren, how easily it is to get distracted by the traditions of this world that seem so innocent when they're putting their faith and their trust in rituals and in pagan rituals. They don't even realize that they're pagan. Vows and rice tossing and all this stuff to symbolize love. In reality, they fail to put their faith and trust in God. A good example is when Abraham sent out his servant out to find a wife for his son Isaac. Then he had Isaac and Rebekah. That's a good example of how God works as far as a wedding ceremony goes. He first sends out a messenger, and if the father improves the wife for the son, then the son would build an addition on the father's house. So, brethren, it's very interesting how the truth of how the whole world, and I'm talking the whole entire world, brethren, rejects the Hebrew tongue. They reject the Hebrew tongue and they adapt to every other nation and tribe and tongue on the face of the earth. It's amazing how even the body of Christ rejects the Hebrew tongue. And they go immediately to the Greek tongue, which was a whole nother nation in a whole different language than the tribe God was from. Completely reject and toss God aside, and they go by a nation that God sent his apostle Shaul to. Hence, God sent Shaul or Paul to the Gentile nation, Greek being a Gentile nation, which was of a different tongue, and they had all kinds of other gods. But today, they still reject God's own tribe of Judah. And they adapt all these traditions of Greek and turn Greek into English, into Latin. Wipe out the Hebrew off the face of the earth. Now, if the devil isn't cunning enough by just some of the traditions that we read, think about what Christ tells you about in Exodus 20, verse 22. Exodus 20 and verse 22 to 26, it says, Adonai says to Moshe or Moses, here is what you are to say to the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen that I spoke with you from heaven. You are not to make with me gods of silver, nor are you to make gods of gold for yourselves. For me you need make only an altar of earth. Simple, brethren. That's all God asks. He says, for me you need only make an altar of earth. On it you will sacrifice your burnt offerings, peace offerings, sheep, goats, and cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. If you do make me an altar of stone, you are not to build it of cut stones. For if you use a tool on it, you profane it. Likewise, you are not to use steps to go up to my altar, so that you won't be indecently exposed. Think about that, brethren. When you go into a modern church today, or even a congregation of God for that matter, what do you see? You see steps leading up to an altar made with nice fancy woodwork, stonework, cut stones. You see, the world does everything opposite of what God says to do. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. He does not change. Why do we so easily, without knowing a lot of times, practice the opposite of what God told us not to do? It always bothered me, even in Protestant churches, of ministers and teachers and performers and choirs, that they'd always go up, raise themselves up above everybody else, when Christ himself would lower himself above everybody else. Christ would go out on the boat on the Sea of Galilee while the people were up on the land. Last time I checked, land is higher than water. When Christ was on the Mount of Olives, he would have people gather all around and he would sit down and teach them. He wouldn't lord over them. He would humbly teach them as he did the 12 disciples. The Lord says, where is the house that you will build for me? Where is the house you will build for me? In Isaiah 66:1 it says, thus saith Adonai in Hebrew tongue, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build for me? And where is the place of my rest? It's interesting to know, brethren, that if we only knew, everybody in the world is waiting for a new temple to be built in Jerusalem. They ain't going to build a Jerusalem temple, brethren. You know why? Because you are the temple. Brethren, you are the temple of God. Apostle Paul writes, he says, don't you know that you people are God's temple? And that God's Spirit lives in you? Where is the house you will build for me? Brethren, right here, that's right here. This is where God resides. There's no work of hands that can build a temple for God. God created the greatest temples ever of his truly beloved sheep. And Christ speaks in the book of John 14:23, that Christ was speaking. He says, if you love the Christ, then the Father and the Christ will make their abode with you. Brethren, having the Father and the Christ within you, the Spirit of God within you, how are we taking care of this temple? How are we rehearsing for the greatest wedding that will ever take place and never will again? A wedding that's going to be forever in faith, the only wedding that's ever going to be faithful and everlasting. You can have great marriages on earth and husband and wife happy, but nothing is ever going to be perfect. But the wedding we're preparing for, that we're waiting for the bridegroom to come take his bride away, because she is making her dress spotless and without spot and without blemish. We're preparing for that very moment, brethren. We are, Christ speaks in John 15. He's saying, I am the vine. I am the vine. You are the branches. Christ is the bridegroom. We are the bride. But that whole chapter of John 15 of the vine and branches is, once you read it, reread it, keep reading it, and then you get more and more pieces of information. Brethren, don't you know that you are the temple of God? What you let in is either from the way, the truth, and the life, or from the evil one. There's only two ways: the way to everlasting life and the way to destruction. You are blessed, brethren. You are blessed with the gifts of the Spirit. Wisdom, knowledge, faith, gifts of healing, working of miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, discerning different kinds of tongues, interpretation of tongues. Brethren, we are bought for a price. We, the bride, bring dowry, which is a payment. That is our spiritual works, our spiritual gifts, our spiritual fruits, our good deeds, our prayers, which is the righteousness of the saints. That's the bowl full of incense in heaven, brethren, is the prayers of the saints. Our faith, our trust in God the Father and the Christ our King is our dowry. That's our dowry paid by the bride's family to the groom. That's what our works, our trust, our faith. Number one is our payment to Christ. And when Christ returns, he's going to bring those crowns with rewards to bless his bride, who's continually preparing, continually keeping her wedding rehearsal dress spotless, continually working on it day and night, always keeping her oil filled, as we read in the Hebrew wedding. And I encourage you, brethren, if you want to have more understanding, almost entirety of God's Word, then I encourage you to study the Hebrew wedding process. In the whole Bible, your eyes will be opened so much that you have this understanding that it's identical to everything from beginning to old. It's amazing how God works, and we reject it. We reject it like it's they're not a God. They're that tribe over there in Israel. Who cares? I mean, they're Jews. I mean, after all, right, brethren? That's how we think as mentality. We reject our own brothers and sisters, and to be clear, not all of them have understanding. Not all of them surrender and obey and trust God. Not all of them don't either. So there's always going to be good and bad. There's always going to be trusting and untrusting. There's always going to be faithful and there's always going to be unfaithful, no matter where you go in the world. But as far as the wedding process, as far as keeping the feast, right on the money. We don't even hold a candle. We're over here with all these other pagan traditions we read about, not knowing. So, brethren, is your wedding garment more bright now than it was at the first you were sent the invitation? Think about that for a moment. Come out of her, my people. That's what Christ tells everybody. Come out of her. Who's her? Well, the great mother harlot, Rome, Egypt, Greece, all these pagan harlotry nations that deny God and reject his word, his holy, set apart, appointed Moedim, or appointed times. God says, "Come out of her, my people," and I want to read Revelations chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. But there's so much knowledge, there's so much in this one chapter alone, brethren. It'll completely make this message make sense. Revelations 18, verse 1. It says, "And after these things I saw under another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried out mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon is become the habitation of demons. The habitation of demons, and she the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations, brethren, remember that, all nations have drunk of her wine, of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich through the abundance of her delicacies, or her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." It's so easy to get caught up in traditions. But you know what the hardest thing is, brethren? Is letting go of things that we love, things that are desirable to the eyes. In verse 9 and through 11 in the same chapter of Revelation 18, it talks about kings and merchants of the earth. They were all mourning because they fell in one day, and all this luxury they had and everything just fell right down. God took it away. In verse 14 it says, "And the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more at all." What fruits? Well, the fruits of all the desires of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. You see the correlation with the mother harlots compared to the church of the Hebrew wedding feast. All this Rome, this focus on the desires of the eyes, it goes all the way back to Eve and Adam, who saw the desire of their eyes, and they had to eat of that both knowledge of good and evil. They had to have that. And then in verse 23, brethren, I want you to listen. Verse 23 of Revelation 18. And the lamp of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all capitalized, all nations deceived. Every nation, brethren, is deceived by the evil one who walks about as a roaring lion. A roaring lion. Does that revelation not describe what we read about in Rome, Greek, British, English weddings? But brethren, I want to focus on a short chapter of the Word of God, and this will bring the whole message to fruition. And that is a message that Apostle Paul, or Shaul is his correct name, I want us, brethren, he that has ears to hear, I want our ears to perk up, because Shaul, after all was a great servant of the Messiah, was he not? He was a great example of what we ought not to do and what we ought to do. Went through great persecution. But brothers, he did not stop. He was sent by God to the Gentiles. The Gentiles, that every nation of the earth is deceived by the evil one, but God has so much mercy for mankind that he sends his messenger out first so that he can prepare the bride, brethren, so that they can be converted and Gentiles can be converted into the house of God. God has mercy on every tribe, every tongue, every nation. Brethren, he has compassion because he died for everyone. How many people would be in Apostle Paul's shoes and go out there and try to convert people that'll kill you for even speaking the truth? And they try to, by stoning him, by putting him in shipwreck and in chains and beating him. But this sums up the whole message in Ephesians chapter 5. This is for us, brethren. This is for you and I and every true member of God, whether you're a Jew, Gentile, or Greek, Church of God, whatever you are, but you are surrendered to God without a name entitled to you. You're a servant of God. That's who we are. We're not no organizations. We're not we're not some people of power. We're not exalting ourselves before anybody. This is for you and I and every called out person that God will and continue to calling till whenever he says it's time. Verse 1 of Ephesians chapter 5, it says, or it reads, so imitate God as his dear children and live a life of love, just as also the Messiah loved us. Indeed, on our behalf gave himself up as an offering, as a slaughtered sacrifice to God with a pleasing fragrance. Among you there should not even be mentioned sexual immorality or any kind of impurity. Keep our wedding dress unspotted, brethren. Or greed. These are utterly inappropriate for God's holy people. Also out of place there are obscurity and stupid talk, of coarse language. Instead, you should be given thanks. For of this you can be sure. Every sexual, immoral, impure, or greedy person, that is, every idol worshiper with empty talk, for it is because of these things that God's judgment is coming on those who disobey him. So don't become partners with them. For you used to be darkness, but now united with the Lord. You are light. Live like children of light. For the fruit of the light is in every kind of goodness, rightness, and truth. Try to determine what will please the Lord. Have nothing to do with the deeds produced by darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things these people do in secret. But everything exposed to the light is revealed clearly for what it is, since everything revealed is a light. That is why it says, "Get up, sleeper, arise from the dead, and the Messiah will abide, and the Messiah will shine on you." Therefore, pay careful attention to how you conduct your life. Live wisely, not unwisely. Use your time well, for these are evil days. So don't be foolish, but try to understand what the will of the Lord is. Don't get drunk with wine, because it makes you lose control. Instead, keep on being filled with the Spirit. Keep your lamp filled. Sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to each other. Sing to the Lord and make music in your heart to Him. Always give thanks for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Submit to one another in fear of the Messiah. Wives should submit to their husbands as they do to the Lord, because the husband is head of the wife, just as the Messiah is head of the sacred community. Is himself the one who keeps the body safe. But as the Messianic community submits to the Messiah, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. As for husbands, love your wives, just as the Messiah loved his special set-apart community, his body. Indeed, give yourself up on its behalf. He gave himself up on its behalf in order to set it apart for God, making it clean through immersion in the mikvah, so to speak, baptism, and the cleansing, in order to present his community to himself as a bride to be proud of, without a spot, wrinkle, or any such thing, but holy and without defect. This is how husbands ought to love their wives, like their own bodies. For the man who loveth his wife is loving himself. Why? No one ever hated his own flesh. On the contrary, he feeds it well and takes care of it, just as the Messiah does his own special set-apart community, because we are part of his body. Therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and remain with his wife, and the two will become one. There is profound truth hidden here, which I say concerns the Messiah and his community. However, the text also applies to each of you individually. Let each man love his wife as he loves himself, and see that the wife respects her husband. Now, brethren, that's the chapter for the body of Christ. That's the chapter for a good example as the bride of Christ, of how we should be preparing, getting our wedding dress adorned, preparing our wedding dress for the groom who's coming back with a shout of a great trumpet and shofar. So, brethren, there is only one way to salvation, and that is the way, the truth, and the life. So prepare and be prepared, standing in your full wedding apparel, ready to meet the bridegroom coming in the clouds of great power and glory, and with the sound of a great trumpet. So let's continue to look from an eternal point of view, God's view. And may you be faithful to God, brethren.